Hello, my name is John Deedy, Professor of Political Science at the Community College of Baltimore County. And today's video is going to be an introductory video for a course called International Relations. And basically when you think about international relations, there's four major things that it kind of encompasses: conflict, cooperation, globalization, and fragmentation. The nuclear crises we've seen the last several years with North Korea and Iran and the international response in many ways are an example of conflict, cooperation, and fragmentation. Conflict can take many forms. It can be the withdrawal of diplomatic relations. It can be a full-blown war. Conflict gets more attention than cooperation because it's conflict. Conflict can involve governments, multinational corporations, and individuals. Often the same global actors will cooperate on some issues and have conflict over others, such as the relationship with the United States regarding China, where there's cooperation sometimes on trade, but conflict with the words Taiwan. When we hear about conflict, at times we think about war, peace, and cooperation. Cooperation is when the parties get together to work together to solve problems, whether it's multinationally or bilaterally. It requires good communications and interactions. Cooperation can be within the existing structures, such as the United Nations, or even such things as organizations like Greenpeace. International relations is a relationship between actors and between states. Tension is all part of international relations. By definition, a nation is a body of people who share a common history, culture, language, or ethnic group. When you want to think about nations, think about Native Americans and Amish in the United States, and they're almost the perfect definition of a nation. A state is a political organization with effective sovereignty over a geographic area and representing a population. A state usually includes a set of institutions that claims authority to make rules that govern people in a society. A state is a political and geopolitical entity. A nation is a cultural or ethnic identity. Popular sovereignty is a belief that the legitimacy of the state is created by the will or consent of the people. Consent's important, and that's the source of political power. One of the big terms that's going to come up this semester is also the word globalization. As the world grew economically during the Middle Ages, even during the Black Plague, with increased trade and commerce, the world started getting smaller. Globalization is where regional economies, societies, countries, and cultures have become integrated throughout the global network of trade, technology, investment, and migration. Globalization can refer to the international distribution of ideas, languages, and cultures, which drive the world economically, socially, culturally, and politically towards greater integration. Think about how small our world is getting. When you have an issue with an appliance or with the cable company, sometimes you're calling a call center, whether it's in Central America or whether it's in India. Many countries have sought the benefits of globalization, such as India. Some countries have rejected globalization and retreat to nationalism, such as countries like Iran or North Korea. Benefits of greater globalization include much larger marketplace, places to trade your goods, but also places to get Western dollars. The downsides of globalization includes tensions caused by migration, a fear of loss of national identity, and the flow of illegal drugs. Globalization has moved very quickly. Terrorists have been able to move around the world and communicate with greater ease because of globalization. But one of the scary things about globalization for a lot of countries is it globalization, or are we becoming Americanized? You know, when an American company comes into India, they bring their own people with their own sense of how to do things in their own way. And sometimes that becomes a controversial thing when it thinks of how is this infringing on the culture of our own country. People worldwide want to preserve their ethnic cultures through their songs, stories, and films. Globalization is changing that culture. As you see American culture come into societies and people say, I want that too. There's a lot of challenges to a borderless world. Increasing globalization raises the questions is what is the future of a state? Globalization is occurring through telecommunications revolutions, globalization of financial markets, and the explosion of international organizations. Globalization is here to stay. Some argue globalization is marginalizing countries as states cede their authority to a multinational corporation. They may say, well, how does a state cede authority to a company? Well, the company is invested in the country. And if you want to keep that Western investment, you may say, we have to do things the company wants to do to make our country economically successful. Fragmentation is a word that I use early when talking about things. It's an adherence to the support for regional or local authority politics and customs. It pulls regions and states back in the focus on their own specific terms and interests and concerns. Fragmentation is often a response to threats against social norms, traditional ways of life, and independence and autonomy, pulling regions and states back in the focus on their own interests and concerns. Fragmentation at times is driven by local, domestic, social, environmental, political, and economic considerations. I've used a lot of fancy nouns and verbs in talking about this. I want to break it down very simply. Think of fragmentation with World War I and World War II, which was inspired in many ways by the rampant nationalism going on. The fragmentation that ended at the end of World War II and the end of the Cold War. The breakup of the Soviet Union and how things were fragmented. Instead of one Soviet Union, you suddenly had 15 to 18 different countries, and how in some ways Vladimir Putin has wanted to put it all back together. The increase in globalization of world politics has caused more fragmentation, things breaking into smaller pieces, as citizens, countries, and groups fear a loss of identity. People want to keep their own identity, and people have a fear of losing that special thing of their own. Another aspect of international relations is anarchy and order, two words that are very opposite of each other. If the system lacks legitimate enforceable authority, you have a fear of anarchy and chaos going on. The United States sometimes puts up with what goes on in other parts of the world like North Korea to maintain order. Global northern states have lost influence due to many of these other states getting involved and getting more weapons. One term I'll use a lot of times is the global north and the global south. The global north is the wealthy, well-to-do economic countries of basically north of the equator. The global south often refers to the countries south of the equator that do not do as well economically. Economic conflict can occur over resources like oil. There's no international police force to enforce many rules and regulations as far as in the global world order. The international community has a stake in the outcome of various world crises. People want consistency. In examining international relations, we must understand ourselves and our views. Many of the mental images of world politics is based on misconceptions and assumptions and stereotyping. It takes a lot to look at things. At times, people take an attitude of, well, we're right and they're always wrong. When we accept an image through our personal experiences, we tend to reject information that may counter it, and that can be a problem. Misconceptions are often the cause and the start of conflicts. Sometimes it takes great leaders to make great decisions. Begin and Sadat made world peace in the Middle East, but it took two special leaders, Gorbachev and Reagan in the 1980s, special leaders. Globalization versus fragmentation and conflict versus cooperation reoccur historically in many aspects of international relations. Finally, think about this. How do you avoid biases and perceptions when you examine politics? Because we all have preconceived biases. We all have things that we assume certain things about. And sometimes it's hard to get rid of a bias, even if we're absolutely sure my bias is right and that person is wrong. England has had a bias against Germany for 200 years.